Good morning and welcome to this strategic conversation organized by Friends of Europe. And I'm your host today. I'm Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. I'm delighted to welcome Johan Lepassar, who is the Executive Director of ENISA, the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, which is located in Greece. Johan is a good friend of Friends of Europe as one of our young political leaders. He's also somebody who is very well known on the Brussels scene. He was the head of cabinet for the former vice president of the European Commission, Andrus Ansip, where he worked on the single digital market. He was also a member of the cabinet of another vice president of the Commission, Sim Kallas, and when he was back in his home country, Estonia, he was an advisor to the Prime Minister on European affairs. And if today I have Johan as my guest, the topic is obviously going to be cybersecurity. In the wake of COVID-19, there have been multiple media reports of the vulnerability of people working from home to cyber hackers or to scammers, and multiple reports of state-level cyber attacks. The latest one this morning comes from Australia, where the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has complained of a major attack against multiple Australian government departments and businesses. So, Johan, the first question that obviously I'd like to put to you as we begin our strategic conversation is, what are you seeing out there? Do you think that we're seeing new things, or is this more of the same? Has COVID-19 really led, in your view, to a major increase in the dimension of attacks and the kind of vulnerabilities that we're going to be facing in the future? And welcome, by the way, and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Jamie. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you and also to all the Friends of Europe. So I think one of the key factors during this crisis, of course, is that there is a rapid digitalization of all aspects of life, and people have now become more used to teleworking. And I think the good thing about it is they also become more aware of the cybersecurity aspects of it. So the news focusing on cybersecurity is not something new for us, but probably is something new for the general public. What we have observed during the past 3 months is that there hasn't been really an uptick in terms of cyber attacks. What has changed a bit is that we've seen that health sector and health-related fields have been more in the focus of cyber criminals. Most of the cyber incidents that we have observed in Europe are related to cyber criminals trying to exploit the situation. So essentially, they're targeting the vulnerable members of the public, trying to through different attack types, phishing attacks, but also just plainly stealing their data or trying to install malware into their computers, trying to hijack people's personal data and just extort and use it as a money-making tool, essentially. So yes, there was an uptick when it comes to hospitals or health sector as a sector. What we usually see, we don't see them as being targeted. During this crisis, that was the case. But also the interesting factor was that the cyber incidents and the cyber attacks really followed the geographical spread of the virus. And that shows that it was just the plain cyber criminals trying to exploit the situation, trying to use the general crisis moment in order to then use different multiple attack vectors to reach out to the general public and trying to extort money.
Johan, what's the answer to this? Is it more sort of public education? Can ENISA play a role in educating the public, warning people? Is it also a question of the police becoming more active in trying to track down these gangs and syndicates? Is it the companies that make the information technology trying to put on more security on their products? Where do you see, the focus in dealing with these criminals?
I think the answer, as always, is in multiple levels. So you need to look at the community, you need to look at the general public, you need to look at the environment. So when we look at the awareness, or the level of awareness of the general public, there's still a lot to do. But also what we can see is that several operators service providers, they only now become to realize how essential cybersecurity is also vis-a-vis their own systems. So there is a lot to do in terms of raising awareness, but also creating these tools, not only for anybody who teleworks or small businesses, that they can use rapidly in order to either assess their risks when it comes to using digital tools, or then take appropriate measures. I mean, kind of having these ready-made toolboxes or checklists available for different target groups, that helps a lot. And this is something that ENISA has been doing over the crisis as well. We've reached out not only to the general public, but also targeted specifically SMEs who are very vulnerable. We've tried to make sure that the critical infrastructure and the critical sectors during this crisis, that they have the best available tools ready, and the information, that they understand, that they have the situational awareness of the situation so that they can prepare. And then, of course, you have the issue of the general environment and the resilience of this environment. And in the environmental field, you have a principle that polluter pays. So if you produce a product that includes pollution, then you have an obligation, towards the society to mitigate this. This is not yet the case in the cybersecurity field. So if you look at the cybersecurity environment, we have tons of faulty products. The ICT products and services are not at all at the level of cybersecurity that they should be, but they circulate in the internal market. And of course, we will be rolling out measures in order to make them more secure in the future. But this is something that is very hard to do once the code is already there. Kind of the legacy systems and trying to see what we can do with the legacy systems, how we can upgrade it. This is an enormous task. And it's not a task only for public authorities, it's also a task for any manufacturer or service provider who puts a product on the market, to make sure that they don't put the burden on the consumer only, but they also make sure that they follow processes so that the product is at the minimum level of cybersecurity that is necessary. So of course, we can talk about certification or standardization as an answer, or liability, but I think in the end of the day, it's the whole environment that needs to be resilient. And cybersecurity is always measured on the weakest link. So we never know where the weakest link is. Hence, we need to have a comprehensive approach on this.
When you talk about the whole environment, that sort of brings me to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is about European strategic autonomy. As you well know from your time in Brussels, this is one of the buzzwords, the buzz concepts around town. And many people in the EU believe that after COVID, the EU needs to be more resilient, more self-reliant, particularly on critical supply chains. Do you think that it's reasonable to believe in the concept of European cyber strategic autonomy, or at least digital autonomy? For example, I know that we have about 450 million EU citizens who rely upon American social media companies, what the French call the GAFAMs, that seem to monopolize this market. We also have the worry that our 5G networks might be dependent upon Huawei or other foreign providers. So, is this the time, do you think, for a push on EU cyber strategic autonomy? Or is this feasible? Is it desirable?
I think it's always desirable to look at your capabilities and trying to upgrade them, and make sure that you do have, let's say, the best capacities and the best knowledge that you can use and deploy in your own markets. And you can marry this concept very well with the concept of an open market. You don't need to close up in this sense, but I think for me, what it means is that you need to have transparent and open standards, or like minimum benchmarkings in place that everybody needs to follow. You need to have systems that audit and assess whether the products and services in your markets follow these principles. And this is something that is not yet there. And we've seen that quite a lot, not only in the context of 5G, but also for other new technologies, or let's say service platforms that penetrate the market at this particular moment. So this is essential. The other aspect of it is the research and innovation. And how can you challenge the market to look into the gaps and try to innovate in a way that does not undermine your own competitiveness and actually strengthens it. And if you look at the whole value chain, I think there are a number of aspects where we have been complacent, honestly speaking, which to our own detriment. And I hope that at least under the new multi-annual financial framework, EU will be more willing also to invest into cybersecurity research and innovation. It's crucial. It is crucial that we develop our own understanding on the new concepts like cryptography, for example. I mean, this is an essential feature of any cybersecure product or a service. And if you are dependent on technology that you don't really fully understand or control, then you create a vulnerability into your own market. And I think this is something that we need to address.
Yeah. Also, over the last few years, as you well know, because you contributed to this yourself in your years in Brussels, the EU has really upgraded its work on cyber resilience. We've had EU strategies and action plans. We've had the establishment, as it was at the time, of an EU CERT, a computer incident response capability. We've had the NIST directive, which reaches out to the private sector to impose certain standards of security. And of course, we've had the creation of ENISA, your own agency. What do you think the cumulative impact of all of these things has been? And is it enough? For example, back in 2017, ENISA itself was, I think, given more powers and a greater mandate. Is this enough in your view, or given the dimensions of the threat, do you think that ENISA should have an even greater mandate and maybe a more operational role on behalf of the EU in directly responding to cyber attacks? So, in terms of how well prepared the EU is, what would be your assessment?
Well, first of all, I think EU is one of the only places in the world or regions in the world where you have a rather comprehensive framework which is being built up in terms of the cybersecurity policies and rules. I mean, you do have facets of it from different angles as well, but I think this kind of a framework is something quite unique. And the NIST directive that you mentioned is essentially, it's a prudent risk management policies. It rolls out an obligation for critical sectors to apply and take measures to mitigate any kind of a risk. The Cybersecurity Act that followed, that introduces the potential of certifying ICT products and services that circulate in the internal market, I think it's an important next step on this. The important thing in this is that the framework is still very flexible. It offers quite a lot of involvement and development within it. And for example, the certification schemes are voluntary. When we talk about the work on under the ENISA framework on the 5G, it's a recommendation, so there is no obligation for the member states to follow it. But what we've seen is that market players in the member states, they're really taken on this common understandings or building these common understandings, and they've shifted their actions and their response. So things have gone for the better, and I see that we built up a minimum level of resilience at the European level. But that, obviously, if you ask, is it enough? It's not enough. But I think it makes sense to build it up step by step. We've had some lessons learned during the non-beta or WannaCry crisis at the European level. We've seen that it makes sense to have, in case of large-scale cross-border crises, that it makes sense to coordinate response at the European level, but also to coordinate the build-up of resilience and capacities to deter these kinds of attacks. So, in my view, I think we have made the first steps very well. It is not enough, and I mentioned that there are areas where I think we have lagged behind, and investment into cybersecurity is one of them. We are also now looking at ways how the market has responded to the new framework. It's relatively new. 4 years is
in
a
EU
short
terms,
time. Yeah. And the Commission has already announced the review of the ENISA directive. So that provides us an opportunity for an upgrade and perhaps do some lessons learned as well.
Yeah, Johan, are there sort of particular areas of the European economy that you think are especially vulnerable? I mean, I was following, for example, the NATO defense ministers meeting yesterday, and they also discussed cyber resilience because NATO, of course, has a role in that area too. And they were sort of pinpointing things like telecommunications and transport and energy as things that they were particularly worried about. As you look at the European scene, do you see that some areas, for example, banks, the financial sector, are well protected, but other areas which are also vital to the EU economy are less protected? Are there particular sort of hotspots here where you focus your efforts?
Well, of course, we started with looking at as well about what are the critical sectors where let's say the prudent risk management approach should be rolled out at first. But in the modern society, I wouldn't like to pinpoint to any and say, well, you don't have to worry. I think all facets of economy in our society do have a digital aspect in it, or they are related to critical infrastructure in a way that let's say the needs for them to invest into cybersecurity are great. So I think we all need to do our efforts, and that's why I'm saying the whole overall environment and this concept of polluter pays. Okay, we don't have it in cybersecurity, and we'll probably never do, but it's good to think about how your actions are going to affect others, and this is something that I think we still miss, this overall understanding of the ecosystem and the importance of it. So I don't want to put particular emphasis on different sectors saying, they lag behind, etc. I think everybody needs to upgrade. It's true that the financial sector was one of the first ones to get the ball rolling, partially because the capital has been flowing between borders in a virtual format for decades already. But now all other sectors of the economy have followed suit, and not only the economy, the society as a whole. We're talking about e-learning nowadays, we're talking about e-schooling and e-working. So I think this is something which shows that, and also in terms of the critical sectors, I mean, we talked about health. It is critical in terms of protecting privacy, but also ensuring this very, very essential service. But who would have thought that e-shopping, for example, or e-commerce becomes also to a certain extent critical in times of a total lockdown, for example. So indeed, there are a number of areas and places where we still need to upgrade our work.
I've just got a few minutes left, and so there are still two things quickly I'd love to ask you before we have to close. The first thing is on technology. I have to ask you to give a brief answer because I know that we could all speak for many hours on this, but I see that ENISA has a working group on artificial intelligence. And one thing that non-experts like myself are always asking is, when you hear about new technologies like AI, like cloud computing, quantum computing, blockchains, are these new technologies, do they make cybersecurity easier on the whole, or do they create massive new vulnerability headaches for somebody like you?
Yes. What I've realized with my experience also in the European Commission before is that all new developments are positive and negative.
Yeah, probably.
You do have both. You have a bit of both. The job of the expert group actually that we convened is to understand better the threat landscape connected with the artificial intelligence and emergence of this new technology. So what are the risks? What are the threat actors or facets when we talk about the AI architecture and the way it might evolve and develop? There is still a lack of understanding of the different aspects of it. And I think that's the first thing that we would like to get from this expert group, expertise essentially on this issue. I think it's too soon to talk about specific threats or specific ways how AI can mitigate different threats. We have theoretical concepts how it can happen and some practical applications of it. But this is very much in the kind of very, very beginning of the development. So we need to enhance our knowledge, and that was also the mission of the ad hoc expert group and why it was convened.
Thanks, Johan. Time for one final question, I hope, in two parts, which concerns diplomacy. We've seen many countries in the EU, also the United States and other countries, start to sort of fight back against hackers, naming and shaming, attribution, extradition requests, and also the EU has been developing a cyber diplomacy toolbox of measures that can be taken. Do you think these have any impact? I mean, when we talk about deterrence against cyber attacks, which are often not the equivalent of an armed attack, is it, do you think, a viable concept that we could effectively deter, or because there are so many different actors using obviously a good deal of anonymity, can we only defend ourselves without really being able to retaliate? And part of this question also, Johan, just to wrap us up today, is do you think that we're any closer now to having an internationally agreed set of cyber norms and codes of conduct that could regulate responsible behavior? Is the EU the sort of organization that could play a major role in promoting these cyber norms?
Well, you asked me to now step on the slippery slope, because ENISA is an internal market agency. We don't really have in our mandates relations with third countries, although there is an international cooperation element of what we do. But what we try to do in Europe, which is essentially try to build up a rules-based cyberspace, it is essential as well, I think, that we don't neglect the rest of the world, and that globally speaking as well, that we do enhance and promote norms and rules of responsible behavior in cyberspace, because the threats that we face in the internal markets, they're global, and the threat actors, they roam freely globally. They do see internet as one space, and we are part of it. So indeed, what we can do in order to promote norms-based and rules-based behavior in the cyberspace, that would be something that also enhances and helps ENISA to fulfill its mandates within the internal market. So I don't want to comment on the issue of deterrence, etc., but I believe that building up resilience is always a deterrent. You know, the more resilient you are, the more, let's say, it makes any potential attacker to think twice. So indeed, I think we deal with this part of the problem, and I'm sure that my colleagues in the External Action Service and elsewhere in the national agencies are quite capable of dealing with the other parts.
Well, thank you. Perhaps the good thing is for us to have another strategic conversation with the External Action Service in due course. But you look remarkably relaxed and tanned and fit for somebody who has such an enormous agenda across the EU to help us to build resilience. On behalf of Friends of Europe, thanks so much for joining us today, for giving us very good, very complete, very comprehensive answers. You were very candid about the dimension of the threat, but you give me some grounds for hope as a result of this conversation that this is a problem that we are dealing with and should be able to deal with even more effectively in the future. So again, many thanks, and hope to have you on another strategic conversation for another update before too long. But on behalf of everybody, again, goodbye for now.
Thank you.